Welcome everybody to this session of the data versioning interest group at RDA 20. It's quite virtual and on-site, and we'll see how we work through this in this hybrid mode. But the previous sessions I've been on worked very well, so let's hope this one goes smoothly. Before we dive into the topic, we would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. We have collaborative notes and the session agenda when you follow this short link, and we'll also paste that into the chat. Please put your name and affiliation into the session notes and tell us about your interest in data versioning. And you can also use the questions and comments on the Zoom chat, regardless of whether you're in the room or attending remotely. If you are in the room and speaking, please briefly state who you are and where you're from, so that people online who can't see you know who's talking. Our agenda for today is to introduce the group. I'll do a quick overview of that, and then quickly also review the data versioning principles and use cases, where I'm not sure, because I can't see the audience, who might already be familiar with these, or for whom this is a new topic, or still thinking about what the versioning principles and use cases mean. After that, we will have lightning talks from members of the group on new use cases or things that have changed. We've already identified 3 things that we added into the use cases document, where we're collecting new use cases in addition to the ones that we already have. And then we will spend the bulk of the session with discussion, not in split rooms as I've just heard, but in one hybrid room, to look at use cases through the lens of the Ferber framework, to explore use cases where data versioning would help data citation and attribution, and to gather requirements for actionable guidelines. And I think that will wrap into the reporting back and looking at the way forward. So the group has been around for a while. We started at P8 in Denver in 2016 with the Birds of a Feather meeting on data versioning to find out whether there's demand and whether there's enough interest, which was quite clear. So at the next meeting in Barcelona, we constituted the data versioning interest group, which quickly formed into a working group. And for those not familiar with the inner workings of the Research Data Alliance, an interest group follows a topic as long as there's interest, but the working group has a work plan that they then need to execute within 1.5 years, 18 months, and present a report. So this is what we did. We, as a working group, in this working group mode, prepared a report and recommendations on data versioning, and those were adopted by the Technical Advisory Board at the Helsinki Plenary. And then we transitioned back into interest group state to promote the adoption of the principles and work on emerging topics in data versioning, because there's quite a bit of things that you discover when you start digging into what versioning means in different scenarios. So here we are now at P20. As the data versioning group has a charter, as all groups have, with 3 specific goals. Firstly, to promote the data versioning principles as the supporting output from the data versioning working group. Secondly, to develop recommendations for the adoption of data versioning principles. And thirdly, to provide a forum for discussing issues related to data versioning, data republication, mirroring, and reusing data. And we see that work on these topics has also been fed into other RDA groups. And maybe there's enough interest in some aspects of this work to form a new interest group or working group where there's no overlap with existing RDA groups. So in this session, we want to talk about the data versioning principles, to look at the new use cases that we have discovered and maybe hear about today, and where data versioning would help data citation and attribution. And then also we want to talk about developing data versioning guidelines, because the principles were fairly high level, but people really want actionable guidelines that they can apply to their situation when they have to deal with data versioning. A brief introduction for those who haven't been exposed to these documents before or haven't heard talks about data versioning before. We have the report on the principles and best practices in data versioning, and we have the collection of use cases that we used to analyze what versioning meant, what kind of versioning we could see in practice, and how we could fit all of this into a unifying framework. The paper was published, or the report was published as a paper in the Data Science Journal in March 2021, discussing the 6 foundational principles of revision, release, data granularity, manifestation of data, data provenance, and data citation. And it introduced the concept of the full path of data, from the idea of doing an experiment to providing data as digital artifacts for download. And to note that nowadays it's very rare for research to be based on a single data set collected in just one campaign. So the framework that we use to, or the lens that we used to look at versioning, that proved to be quite useful, was the functional requirements for bibliographic records, FRBR for short, and also practices in software versioning. And I think there will be an example a little bit later to explain what works, expression, manifestation, and item mean, the terms from FRBR. But what we were able to do with this was to formulate this framework and the principles that now need to be turned into best practices and actionable recommendations. So one of the things that we can now tackle in a more systematic way is how to give proper credit to various parties involved in supplying data. And also that raised interesting questions about attributions and ethics and data publishing. Leslie, I think this is your part. Leslie?
Yes, I'll unmute and stop talking to myself. Okay, if Jens, you can keep moving the slides for me.
I will.
Thanks. And okay, so as Jens said, we're now recognizing that it's pretty rare for data to be a result of a single campaign, for an individual to go out, collect data or rocks, come back, write a report, etc. And they're really, really complex. And what we talk about often is integrating data sets horizontally. So taking one data set from one site and another site and then putting them together. Increasingly, we're realizing the importance of what we call vertical integration along the full path of data, in that you have like raw data, it's usually processed by experts, and someone might publish it and a researcher can do a subset of it, do something on it, and then images can be produced. And so in order to get this our heads around exactly what was going on, next slide, please, Jens. Okay, so this is ASTA. So ASTA is one of the satellite missions. And over on the left, you have the work. And the work was the expense of getting that satellite up and taking all these pictures. Then you had the raw telemetry data come down. Then we did some calibration to it, not changing it all that much. Again, we keep producing more and more versions that are making it more analysis ready for other people to do something with. And so you can sort of see here how we were producing what we call level 3, level 4 products, which are the main things that are available for researchers to use. But then we found that each product could then be put out in, say, multiple versions, what we call the manifestation. So the BSQ files, GeoTIFF or NetCDF. And then each one of those files could be available from a different site. And I think this is what we're all learning to happen now, is that the so-called data that was originally collected in the field has multiple expressions, manifestations, and appears everywhere. And so we started to systematically work this through, because the important thing is that quite often where someone has an image or a product over here on the right-hand side under items, they rarely reference the work back at the start. And so this is where we thought maybe versioning could help. Next. And so this is what we based it on, the NASA processing levels, where we're actually starting to quantify what the levels of products are, and then thinking about the expressions of the original work, and thinking about, who did what where, how do we get that attribution into the individual layers. Next, please. And so in AuScope, which is the research infrastructure for Earth Sciences, amongst our research infrastructures, we're starting to develop these. So this is one that's been developed for geochemistry. And again, by doing these vertical layers of data, you can actually see where we can start to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges. Next. And this is another one we did for magnetotelluric data set. And I've got the orange box here. And what that is, and in the previous one, what that is outlining is the like behind the scenes stuff that you never really see, because you just tend to work from the what we call the analysis ready data. And so then we started to think, if you go to the next slide, please, Jens, you can see how this vertical integration concept works, because even if I've got it drawn horizontally, sorry about that, you sort of see how you often create many more products from earlier versions. If an error, but if you've got them all interconnected with identifiers and all your versions tagged, you can see how if something goes wrong, say here with a level 1, you can trace it through to products that have been derived from it and know that, oh gosh, they're going to be suspect as well, and something needs to be done to fix them. But the important point we're trying to get over is that organisations, people, funders are unlikely to be the same for all levels of processing. And so what we want to do is start to define these different, what we call expressions, manifestations, and items, because we can preserve attribution, licensing, and identity of the less processed products and start to get credit for them. Next slide, please. And so if we're going to get credit, we've also got to start to think more seriously about the roles that are associated with each level of processing. And you can see here there's some attempts at starting to become quite common with, say, credit. The ISO, DataCite, DCAT all have a thing in their metadata for roles. And there's an excellent publication by Ted Haberman there on Zenodo where he's done contributor roles, crosswalk. And if you think about it, each role funder can be a citable DOI in the metadata at each level of processing, and the provenance statements will link each level of processing. And as I said, I've got the ECIP citation cluster there. They've been working on this for some years. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a little bit complex, and I'm basing it more on, say, where you've published work off samples, but you can see how the dataset publication, and by using DOIs, ORCIDs, RAIDs, etc., we can get identity into each level of processing or each version, and be sure it goes back to the original group that collected or funded any component of the data set. Impact can be measured. Funders love to see it. And then this attribution citation can be cited in CVs, project proposals. So the next slide, please. And so we go back to saying that data versioning and tracing all these different versions, products that are created from a source data set is something that is now within our grasp, provided you actually structure and understand within whatever domain you're working in what the equivalent level noughts, ones, twos, and threes are. And my last slide, and I guess why I got onto this is that I work here mainly on the left at NCI, which is a major data repository. And it costs a lot of money to run these big repositories, and all over the world, we're finding we're becoming what we call the invisible repository, because what's happening when people publish papers is that they cite the data set that goes with the paper, but not all this previous history. And so really, I just wanted to say here that we've started to find working out this versioning and expressions, manifestations, etc., helps you structure your provenance better. But more importantly, if they're linked through DOIs or identifiers like is derived from, you can start in a machine-to-machine readable way, be able to build up citation and credit for what we're calling the invisible repositories. That's it, Jens, back to you.
Thank you, Leslie. So use cases. We based all of our work on use cases, and every now and again we publish a new version, release. In supporting the output from the working group, we had 39. We have collected a few more. One, and you can go to the Google document and add more or tell us about them, and we will add them. So let's look at them. So one of them that we discussed in a smaller subset of the group was the difference between algorithmic revision and editorial release. This is something that we already touched upon in the original report, but it's something that has surfaced again in a blog post that's referenced at the bottom of the slide about algorithmically finding changes in data sets, and an algorithm to explain what has changed. But the thing that running a diff on comparing two files, well, it returns a report to show us what has changed. The question is, why did this happen? And this is the core of this difference between the revision and the release. The revision tells us that the bit stream has changed, and this algorithm is helpful in analyzing that change. But it doesn't tell us whether this what the significance of that change is, because that also depends on the use and the user community. So this is where we see this editorial step in the release to communicate to the designated user community the significance of that change, not only the magnitude of the change. There's not necessarily a correlation between magnitude and significance of the change. Ming, do you want to talk about the Figshare case?
Yeah, the next two cases, Figshare and from Open Science Foundation, are kind of example of editorial, release of a version. So in the Figshare case, they support versioning for the open data, that the data made open at both item and collection level. So in Figshare terms, an item is a file set, or a file set with multiple files. A collection is grouped together relevant content into a themed collection. So for each version, they have a new DOI that can be cited independently for each new version. And the version DOI is created based from a base DOI by adding version number as a suffix. And the base DOI points the latest version in the series. But what constitutes a new version, or then here are conditions, what encountered as a new version. So it treats a little bit differently for item and a collection. So as long there are some similarity here as well. So as long as you modify title, modified author, and change the license, and for item, add a new file, remove file, replacing file, or remove permanent embargoes from files, that all triggered as a new version, and thus meant a new DOI. Any other change, for example, if you change the description, any change not listed here are not treated as new version.
Sorry if I jump in.
Yeah.
This is really interesting because in our report we said that changing the metadata doesn't make a new version. So changing the
Yes.
catalog entry doesn't make a new version. So this is a different approach.
Yes, but for example, if you change the title, that's metadata. That's I guess the title tells about what that data set about. If you change, it depends how the change the title changes the content of that. Reflect the change of the content. So anyway, here is Fixture's role. You can follow the link there for detailed description. Yes, could you move to the next? Yeah, thanks. And another interesting use cases we collect is from Open Science Foundation. So here's a link. You can looking for detailed information. Basically, OSF has built-in version control and retained all copies of files that are uploaded to OSF. So when new version of file, you have a new version of file, and you want to upload to OSF, as long as that file has the same name as the previous one, OSF will update the previous file while maintains a record of that file. So on the left side of diagram is too small, but basically the OSF has one DOI for all versions. So if you have a new version added, new version file added to this collection, you can click on that file. You can see the change of all revisions of that file. And what the recommended citation is to use that DOI plus the version number. Yeah, so that's use cases, two use cases of how editorial process lead to the version change. Back to you, Jens.
Thanks, Ming. So just again, if you encounter other use cases where versioning is being used, please contribute them to the group so we can analyze them and see if there's any new patterns emerging or new interpretations of the principles that we formulated in the report, and how could inform actionable guidelines. So we proposed 3 discussion topics for the remaining time. It's about 40 minutes discussion. And we wanted to explore use cases through the Ferber framework lens. Explore use cases where data versioning would help data citation and attribution, and then gather requirements for actionable guidelines. And Kirsten, you have your hand up.
Yes, I have my hand up. I would like to raise a question to the use cases. I don't know when we slice this in.
I can't see the agenda at the moment.
Or maybe
sorry, Kirsten, you want to see use cases, or
no?
You want
I would like to comment on these use cases, especially on the Figshare one.
Oh, okay.
And just raise a general question that might be a bit out of range. So I think it would fit if I just do it now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, yes.
If
yes.
I hear, and I'm happy you made this comment, Jens, that changing the metadata does not require the change of the data. And there are definitely use cases, or there are cases in my experience where we do change titles because of typos, because of further thinkings, but do not change the data. My question is, and I'm observing this for a long time, the Figshare use case is very similar to the Zenodo, where you just submit the data and you automatically get 2 DOIs because they generate one of these collection DOIs in addition to the first version. So whenever a new version of the same data is submitted, this general collection DOI will be that which links to the uppermost or to the latest version. My question here is, this system can only work when people are aware of this. And if they are not aware of this, which means if they are not knowing about this DOI, and I know that most researchers do not know because I'm usually explaining that to them, the system is only working within Zenodo. So if you look at your ORCID record, you just get the double number of citations or of works because all DOIs are separately registered. And if I think about even more versions with independent DOIs, and I imagine the DataCite catalog being harvested as one of the first sources of many portals, I wonder who's tidying up all these records and who makes sure that which of the 100 DOIs describing the different versions or manifestations of the same data would be the good one. And I think this could be something where we should also develop guidelines, because this is increasingly getting a mess the more identifiers we are using.
This is a very good point, because it also raises the question of what we want to give credit for in a data publication, and whether we want to give the usual use case, I think, is, from a researcher and scholarly perspective, is that we want to give attribution to the expression of the work, or the work, to the intellectual creative output. But we're actually working, what we're actually working with is on the item level, which is something that then interests the repositories, because they have all the work and of maintaining the infrastructure for serving those items. And this Zenodo use case kind of straddles that boundary, where we have this umbrella DOI that actually references the expression, and we have under that umbrella several other DOIs that identify items that we actually download and work with. That's my interpretation.
But the researchers are not aware of this, and I think everything we do has to be adopted. And I know how many times I'm discussing with authors of papers, we don't need a revision, just add the general DOI, because this will always lead to your latest version. But to be honest, and if we are speaking about linked data and bringing everything together, and it is getting really confusing. And now we know that now IGSNs will be registered as DOIs, which means that we have yet more, and you see the granularity of IGSNs being adding to these catalogs. And then who should ever be able to tidy up this catalog without really knowing what to remove and what not to remove? And I think we should address this issue too, not in this group only, but on the general scope, I think.
Yep. Any other comments on the use cases? Anybody in the room? I can't see the room. I can only see the screen in the room.
Yeah, if you could just say who you are. Or you can come up.
Hi, this is Hans Pfeifenberger. I guess you see me, perhaps.
Yes.
Yes.
Somewhere,
Hi,
Hi.
Hans. Good
somewhere.
to see you.
I have a question. I must admit I haven't yet read your article in full, but you're now talking about the question of citation, getting credit, etc. Have you thought about machine actionability? Like, what do I really need to do, replicate work, or to go back to the previous status of work, or to improve on work, but all that machine actionable, going through all these levels of from work to item. Do we really need to address items, individual items, if they are all identical? Or is it good enough to reference the, what was it, the expression? Must that be machine actionable? How do I find then items somewhere, like satellite images at Google Earth Engine versus at the Copernicus store of ESA, etc., etc.? Have you thought about that? And machine actionability in general, or in particular?
Thanks, Hans. Those are excellent questions that we, I think, would have treated as a flow on from developing actionable guidelines. But I think you're making a really relevant point that we should keep machine actionability in mind right from the start.
Jens, I'd add that certainly the work we're doing in the 2030 Geophysics project at the moment, it is like where we're trying to trace back from the final product back to the raw data. It has to be machine actionable. It's just too complicated to make it human readable. And that's where you're relying on having a comprehensive metadata, so the raw data, and then you go to the next level up and you say this is derived from the previous product. So the richer metadata is in the previous product. So I think we're definitely trying to do it through identifiers. Yeah, I would agree. It just can't be done. And we're finding, like, even a simple thing like citation, like the reference, the human readable reference for a data set is just no longer suitable because it doesn't capture this previous history. It's got to go to machine actionable.
So this is Hans again. I just wanted to add that machine actionable, this machine actionable traceability would also perhaps help with Kirsten's question about cleaning up or simplifying this record for human readability.
Yep, good point. Thanks. Any other voices from the room? So there's a comment from Jesper Fries from Sintef, and the point that there's probably a lot to learn from version control systems like Git. Yes, we did look at Git in the use cases. It's one of the use cases documented in the use cases document, and we should revisit this in the light of machine actionability. And any other comments?
Yes, you have your hand up. Is that...
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't write. I didn't put it down. It was my mistake.
No worries.
Someone else?
So maybe let's quickly look at some versioning use cases through the Ferber lens. We've gone through this example already. Leslie, do we want to go through it again? Was there something you wanted to add?
Not really. I mean, better still, is there anyone who can't understand how this system works?
This just example. There are templates and more examples to follow.
So yes, so remember the blue lines going through the screen, the slide. They'll repeat in the next examples. So we have this template where the Ferber model starts at the top level of with the concept of a work, which is the distinct intellectual or artistic creation. This is then expressed as a artistic or intellectual realization of that work, and is manifested, which is a physical embodiment. In data world, it's the file format, and then it's made available as an item. This is the thing that you actually access, and in data world download. It's down at the bottom is what this means for actions of people or corporate bodies. The work is created by a person or corporate body. It's realized by a person or corporate body. It's then the manifestation is then produced by this, and the item is owned by, in as much as you can say owned by. In the world of books and other physical media, owned by makes more sense than in the digital world, where I think we should say made available or served by. So I think, Leslie, this is for you, the geophysics use case.
Okay, so what do you want me to do? Do you want me to just
quickly walk through how you fitted
okay.
this geophysics use case into Ferber, and then
Okay,
see
so
if there are any
somebody,
questions.
at great expense, someone goes out and does a passive seismic survey of the Hammersley Basin, which means putting out I don't know how many seismometers and leaving them over a year. So it's quite an expensive piece of work to collect that. And then the bits and bytes that are retrieved are put into a time series data. But the important thing is give two seismologists the same set of data, and you'd be lucky if you got two solutions. You probably get 22. But they can be valid, and each needs to be recognized as a separate, I mean, provided they are different, but they may be done because they're targeting different depths or different frequencies or something like that. So, I mean, having different solutions from the same data is quite viable, because it's not necessarily there is a unique solution. But having got that solution, you can have it in at least 3 formats. Probably should have added tile DB, so that increasing number of formats, because people are a bit unstable with the formats they're using. But that same data set, I can then go and get from the AusPass site, Geoscience Australia, or I can get it from IRIS, which is in the US. But we prefer to treat each item as something separate because it's on a different infrastructure. And you never quite know whether something will go on with one infrastructure that maybe intentionally, or they update their software, or inadvertently something gets changed. And so that's why we're saying from this original piece of work, you can straight away see how we've already started to get multiple versions, products, etc. on the available. Because don't forget also with the internet, these things proliferate very easily. And so that's why we're saying probably that each one of those should have a separate metadata record and a separate DOI, but be linked back to the earlier versions where appropriate.
Any questions or comments for Leslie?
Yeah, yes, I have a question. Maggie Hellström from ICOS, the university. So one other thing that can happen.
I can't hear you.
You need to come to the lectern and use the microphone.
There isn't one in the room, so room.
Okay, yeah, so hope you can hear me now. This is Maggie
Yep.
Hellström from ICOS and Lund University. One other thing that can happen along the way here, on the way to the forum, as it were, is of course that the digital manifestation of the data can also advertently or on purpose inadvertently be changed from, say, from single to double what we say, precision and things like that. Yeah, or you can, yeah, similar cases like that. And in that case, of course, the checksum of the object changes, but the data itself might still be okay because maybe it was in single precision from the beginning, but expressed as double precision, so you don't lose anything in the truncation. But that's also adding to the complexity here. And should that have a different version or not? And how do you think about that? And then one more comment that sort of sprung up, and also I have to say, like Hans, I didn't really read up on all the details of the group's outputs earlier, but in some cases, I think we also need to be careful when we talk about metadata about the data set here or about the digital asset in general, because of course the metadata that is on Zenodo or Figshare or any repository level is just the administrative metadata, so to speak, the ownership, the authorship, maybe some details about how it's connected to other things, funders, etc. But the actual metadata about the contents of the data set or asset are usually kept separate, maybe in another catalog or in a repository or in the form of files or something like that, that may or may not be bundled together with the digital data object that you are giving a version. And then you can also get this very interesting and very rapid sort of divergence between a metadata object being edited, updated, needs another version, but the data stays the same. And then what do you do? So I think even if we do manage to annotate all of this, so to speak, in a way that is machine actionable, that there will be always room for loads of confusion. So maybe we need also to be very clear in recommendations to end users of both data and metadata that they really need to keep track of these things in their own analysis process so that the provenance of the final research output can really be replicated, understood, and followed. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And I think for us, a major aim of the versioning working group was to develop a vocabulary that allows us to describe what we see and not call everything a version. There's all these differences to things that make versions, and having a vocabulary or terminology to describe what we see, as we thought would be useful. And so to take your example of the change in precision, that might not change the scientific content of the data, but it changes the way it's presented to us. And in this framework, we would call it the manifestation. This is something that in the early days of the precursor to DataCite we came across when we wondered whether we should include a checksum into the metadata of a DOI record. And because of the practice at the Pangea repository of offering data in different character encodings, which would result in different checksums, we said this doesn't make much sense. But back then in 2004, we didn't have the understanding of the subtleties between what we were talking about, that we didn't understand that Pangea was offering different manifestations of the same expression of the work. So I think that is something that we can handle, but the issue of metadata, I think, is something that we need to revisit in the interest group, to include that into guidelines of what the relationship is and whether there's a separate identity to metadata. Because if you start tracking changes in the metadata, that implies that they have a separate identity to the object that they describe.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to try to write up a very brief description of how we do things in my research infrastructure, because it's sort of a mix between different approaches, so it's not very clear, sometimes not even to ourselves, exactly yes. what is what. But so just to mention that we actually calculate our PID text string. It's based on our checksum of the data object, but the PID resolves to a landing page which contains the metadata. So you will always get it back to the actual data object that we started with, but the metadata that is shown on the landing page maybe have been updated throughout the course, because sometimes we add more fields or we correct typing errors and things like that. And our end users are fine with that because they know what to expect. But if someone else sort of surfs in and suddenly notices that, hey, when I resolved this PID, I did it yesterday and I did it today, and I don't get the same metadata, can I really be sure that it's the same digital object? Which you can.
Yeah.
But anyway, thanks a lot.
Thanks. So we see an emerging topic here with the changing metadata.
One second. Just make a short comment. Hi, Jens. It's Sally from DataCite. Yeah, so this metadata question is very interesting, because in the implementing fair workflows project that I'm leading, we also have this chunk of work set aside to figure out a way to incorporate domain-specific metadata to whatever the generic metadata the DataCite DOIs are collecting, which is domain agnostic, right? And so where do we put? So we want to collect something that's useful for the researchers, not just for the repositories institute. For the researchers, and we do this through the CDAR metadata template workbench, and then we built a little template with metadata properties that is relevant for the research. We work with the neuroscience team, and this is very different, obviously, and to gather some metadata properties, and then it will generate a separate metadata file, and that will be deposited alongside with the dataset. And we also, the way we're trying to do it, it's one way of doing it. I don't know if it makes sense to everyone in the room here, but what we're doing it is we try to give the metadata template a DOI. We kind of identify that template, and we say this sort of neuroimaging research can use this template to generate a somewhat standardized set of metadata, and then you can connect this identifier, the template identifier, to the data set, and then you have machine actionable way of going to how to parse that specific metadata. So I hope that makes sense. this has been very difficult to explain to the research team how this is supposed to work, but this is one attempt. So if this equals resonate with any of them, we would really like to know, because we feel like we're doing something very specific, and yeah, I mean, the usefulness needs to be tested, I guess. Yeah.
Yep, and that links also nicely to what Hans spoke about earlier with the need for machine actionable elements. Kirsten?
Yeah, thanks. I think that the actual metadata, may this be expressed as XML or JSON, is machine readable. And we have to explore and maybe make recommendations on how we include information on changes of metadata or of the data into that metadata. If I look at the data side metadata, it has a version field, so you can keep the same DOI and count the version up. When we do this at GFC, we make sure to have a track change, because people have to let us know what happened, what changed, and this is then included in the field. For that specific version track change, there's no dedicated field in the data side metadata yet, and this can be improved certainly. But I think we don't need to invent a new thing, because we can be transparent by using existing tools like DataCite or Crossref metadata for discovery. We have to think about, and this here I come back to Maggie's comment, certainly these have to be linked to the domain specific metadata. And I'm speaking at this point from like what our geophysicists are doing with seismological data archives or GNSS. And at this point, it has to be absolutely clear that the discovery metadata that we are collecting as a repository that serves as finding the data and providing all the information, that there's also a link to the, for example, geodesy ML file or seismic ML, which includes the specific metadata for the individual objects identified with the DOI. But this has to be done by the repositories, because if people go to Zenodo and they just want to use this fancy get a DOI in 10 minutes service, they might not be aware of that. So it turns back, and the work has to be done by repositories, I think. And people have to be educated to do so, because someone has to make it machine readable. And once it is, we can do everything, but people have to feed their information into the system.
Hello, I'm Anders Conrad from Dijk in Denmark, and I apologize for not having studied your work or followed your group, but I am, however, familiar with Ferber, and I'm familiar with this idea of the full cycle of various products along a processing line. So I had a few questions. First, now we have this Ferber model, and also with respect to the discipline metadata discussion, I would remind that Ferber is a quite old, as it says, it's a set of requirements, a kind of referential model from the library world. And in the end, all metadata are at the item, because you don't have anything, you only see these are categories through the item. And it's for it even says in the name, for bibliographic records. So there's some intellectual work to consider when you use a model like that, how it can fit to this use case. I'm a little surprised, I must admit, that this would be the most appropriate. But in any case, it raises a question for me, if you are going to sort of instantiate these abstract parts of the model to describe it with particular meta, are you kind of thinking to also version records for the manifestation, records for the expression? I'm not quite clear. I don't think I understand. Or are you just thinking you are versioning the items in the end, which is what a library would do? That's my one question. And the other is, how do this relate to this full-scale model that Leslie was describing very nicely? Are you thinking that all these products at all the levels, which can be very relevant for research in various ways, would you need to incorporate all these different data products in such a Ferber model, and how would that work?
Leslie, yes.
Yeah. Oh, thank goodness we found someone who knows Ferber. Because when we first started this work, we shopped around for something that gave us context. And I remember we started to feel this was something to work, and a librarian said to us, "Oh, you're not using that old stuff, are you?" So, but to be serious, I guess what I was trying to do was just create a map, because so I work at a major repository, and we had about 3 groups wanting to bring the same data set along, which was this ASTA data set. And it was only when I did that map according to Ferber as to the work, the expression, like, you know, the difference between 2 of them was they had the same original version of the product, but they were in different formats. And so it enabled us to map out the different products that were coming along. But then beyond that, we were able to show that if we could use linked data is derived from, then the people who'd put all the blood, sweat, toil and tears into particularly geophysics, going out and collecting that data in the field, we were able to start to get citable credit for them. And I know identifiers have to move a little bit further along, and the publishers have to be able to trace them a bit better. But we could see how in the future with the knowledge graph, we could really graph, say, take the passive seismic survey of the Hammersley Basin and just see, you know, how many different products had been produced from it, what papers they'd been put in, were they high impact papers, etc., etc. And so, yes, you're right, it's bibliographic references, but we found it a really highly structured, well thought out model that enabled us in the modern digital age to relate to. So yeah, we'd love to talk to you afterwards, because yeah, it's anyway, it's just sort of been something that we did. I think that's all, Jens.
Yep.
Thank you.
Just monitor the. Okay. So
Sorry, Jens. With the
yes.
gentleman who just spoke, can you make sure you put your name in the or if you would like us to contact you, and everyone who's here, can you please put your name in the notes that we've been passing around and your email?
Thank you, Leslie. I have registered.
And did you put Ferberman beside your name?
No, please don't call me that. I used to work 15 years in the Royal Library, Copenhagen, and I got enough of Ferber.
But if you've got something, okay, you're in the library world. If you know of something else that can help us do it.
I'm not sure I'm the right person, but I might join the discussion. I'm out of the library world, but I think even there I didn't hear about Ferber for quite a number of years. For one thing, we tend to move towards more RDF compatible formats, even in the library world, where you can, for instance, map is something like this version of, or is related to, all these kind of relationships between different categories. I think even in the library, Ferber was, to be quite honest, too complex to be really useful. That's my personal opinion.
Okay.
Well, the main point though for us was not to take Ferber and apply it to data, but to develop a terminology that allows us to to talk about all those different things that we encounter when we talk about versions, and not call everything a version, but to be able to be a bit more precise. But if there's a different framework that is better aligned with modern practices, we can revisit that.
Hello, I'm Ton Smeler, Utrecht University. In our university, we're currently looking at data governance in terms of not just data sets, but data collections. And I was wondering whether we can link machine actionable, ideally, the entitlements to data, the rights holders basically to the data. At what level would that be? Would that be sufficient at the expression level in combination with the version? Would that be, always the same on the author level, but also on the producer level of the database, if you like, the data collection? Would that be consistent, or do you have certain use cases or situations where that would turn into an issue?
Good
Yes,
question.
we do have
Leslie.
it. Yep, we do have this where it turns into an issue. And oh gosh, how can I say this? It gets involved in licensing, and that's another thing too, is to make sure you've got the license correct on the earlier product, because quite often people generate a product and say it's CC BY when they're actually not realizing that they're using data from a lower level that is actually restricted. There's another case where there's a lot of compilations being done from the literature, and the source of the data in the compilation is CC BY with attribution. But then when you get the compilation, it doesn't attribute the data sets that have gone before it. So, and part of the reason why we also started this work was because there was a bit of an outcry at the time of like web scraping and repositories taking just, we have this happen to us at NCI in Australia, where people have copied our service endpoints and put them into their database or their online GISs, and they're not citing NCI. So it's kind of critical that we get the structuring in and recognize that these things can change as you go up the products, up those processing levels.
Yes, but and also for reuse, it will be crucial to be able to identify whether you have the right entitlements, just citation, but beyond, all the stakeholders are identified.
Yeah.
But do you see situations where that would lead to, you need to look at the manifestation level even, or to identify the right stakeholders? You do. I see some nodding here.
Yeah. That's the whole reason why I did that map of the ASTA data, so that I knew what we were getting at NCI, because if we were going to be a distributor of those data sets, we wanted to be sure who had the rights to be actually even giving it to us.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Thank you for answering. Yeah.
Thank you. Great question. Looking at the time, I think we have 17 minutes left. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep.
We should have a look at how we get to actionable guidelines from the principles and framework level. So it's also a question to my co-chairs. Do they agree that we should jump to this point on the agenda now?
Yep.
because that will also tell us then in the last minutes where we want to go next.
Yeah, good point.
I'll agree to anything.
Thank you. I'll come back to that. So on the screen, I think you should be able to see that are the 6 principles that we formulated from our analysis of the use cases. The first being this point of version control and revisions, noticing that there were changes in the bit stream. And I think that area is fairly mature because there's a lot that we have already learned from software versioning. But from a data perspective, it might need some refinement. Then there's the level of the release, where identifying, which is about identifying releases of a data product, which have gone through that editorial decision process of we want to release this particular revision as a new release of this data. There's also something that, of course, this is informed by software versioning, where we have product releases and not just the nightly builds. But also, again, this is something I think that's important for repositories to develop procedures around that, how they communicate the significance of changes to their users. Am I going too fast with my conclusions on that, or is this something where we should actually sit down in the next 6 months and spell those recommendations out before we move on to the next set of questions?
We have a comment in the room.
Hans again. I can't keep my mouth shut. Sorry.
No.
I have and especially since I have a radically different suggestion. I think we spoke a lot about the complexity of it all, and I think it would be perhaps helpful to break that complexity down into recommendations aimed at specific stakeholders. First of all, the data user, make the data user aware of, let's say, some of these concepts, that they are using an item which is a copy, which may be a defective copy even, etc., which could be traced back to an originator, which properly should be mentioned in an academic sense. There could be recommendations for data producers, like the seismic people, making them aware what will happen, and they should somehow choose the right data distributor so that their work will be tracked or traceable. And of course, recommendations for repositories and the like. But I think these are the main stakeholders to address first, and perhaps that will also help thinking about how to make this more simple or whatever.
Yep, I think that's a great suggestion, to take different stakeholder perspectives and yeah. Kirsten?
Yeah, just because I wrote it in the chat and Hans might not read it. Hans, this is an excellent idea, and I see similar approaches also with the Enabling Fair Data project, where there were specific guidelines repositories should do that. The task of publishers is that, and I think by starting with this approach, we might be spread out a little more, but we will definitely make it easier, because different stakeholders definitely require different approaches. So thank you very much for that. bringing it on the plate.
Are there community-specific differences that we should also take into account? Probably yes. No, doesn't make things too complicated.
Sorry again. I think the perspective, especially of data producers or users, would be quite different if you have a biologist producing an Excel file and versions of that Excel file, where they might have the suggestion that they track the changes in their Excel file in a specific sheet where they specify what has changed from version 1 to version 2, etc., which would be very pragmatic. To this example you cited about the satellite images, where, of course, a lot of professional people are involved who are all doing all this level 1, 2, 3 stuff and so on, where you can actually go into writing up pages and books of instructions versus this single biologist. So yes, there should be differences, especially at the user or producer level.
So that's also certainly very important for the editorial level, where the data producer needs to communicate the significance of any changes. And if it makes a big difference whether this is, taking Hans' example, somebody uploading an Excel sheet versus a team of data and information professionals producing data products. Should we, as an interest group, also pay more attention to the metadata question? As I said, in the past, we had a position where we said changing the catalog entry doesn't change the content. So the principle of not looking at the revision on the content level wouldn't mean that if there's no revision on the content level, we wouldn't need to version the metadata. Kirsten.
I think for that, we need to differentiate too between the discovery metadata and the contextual metadata, the similar story Maggie told. And if I look at practices, like, for example, the site logs of GNSS data, they record every change in these site logs to make sure that the data is not misinterpreted. And this is very, very community specific. That is very similar to what the seismology is doing. But I think on the discovery metadata, what we like, I'm running a repository, and we always have the case when people say, no, the journal requires the data to be online, but I only get the DOI of the paper after the paper has been published. So of course I need to update the metadata. If I stood there as a repository manager and said, no, you don't get the DOI, I need the paper DOI, we will have a conflict, and this is not a solution. So I would definitely differentiate between which type and what you're changing in the metadata. And even, I must admit, if someone tells me, look, my data has been cited in another paper, I'm happy to add the DOI of that new paper to the metadata just to complete the record. And I see this as a big opportunity for data publication landing pages. Well, it's not scalable, but this could be.
Yeah, this obviously needs some more work for us to understand what that means for communicating what has changed. Any other? Sorry. Yep.
Hello. I'm afraid I haven't been following this group, and I'm of limited intelligence. This is all very interesting work. How are you planning to feed this back somehow into the data management plan activities?
I think we should. I refer to my co-chairs. What do you think? Kirsten?
Oh, here you got me. I think it would be good if data management plans were used as they were intended to, but so far what I see from the user side, they write it because they have to, but no one is using the possibilities of data management plans to really keep track on what happened with their data, because then we would end, and this is what I often hear from my researchers, if the tools you are using require more time than making your research, who would use the tools? And I think we have to find an equilibrium to that, but we can, of course, try to make recommendations of how to include this in data management plans.
It could be a perspective in when we develop the recommendations. Any other comments?
Not from me.
So then I think the question is where from here? So we've received a lot of really valuable feedback today that will inform our discussions, and I'm pretty sure there will be another session of this interest group at the next plenary in Salzburg, isn't it, in October? So how do we structure our work until then? Is there interest in the audience of us organizing an intermediate meeting to discuss things, or should we be using an online medium forum to discuss the questions that came up today?
Am I just on as soon as I walk up here? Okay, just one thought, not a complete answer to your question, but just in terms of like some of the parts, like, because like you even already mentioned, there's certainly overlap with a number of the other RDA groups that I'm thinking about. The data granularity group that I'm in, for example, that we have a session tomorrow afternoon. But and we've looked certainly at your outputs of your principles, especially as they pertain to granularity. And so maybe something that can be done between now and October at least is kind of connecting with those other groups and coming as guests to those meetings and kind of figuring out where they coalesce and that kind of a thing, and just making sure those synergies are more well established.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I'm looking in the wrong place because I'm looking at you, but you're really there.
Yeah. Can I just follow on from that? I mean, like, we have looked before at other RDA groups, and like, because the number one was the dynamic data citation, but there's data granularity. Can we just have a call out quickly for any other groups that anyone knows we could be overlapping with? Because we did do a pretty thorough search about 2 years ago. I hadn't thought of granularity. I think this is the problem, that as these groups evolve, their scope changes, and so we don't pick up that we might be working on the same thing.
Yeah, so this is Maggie again. So I think there are loads of different groups that somehow, at least partially, overlap with this issue. So there's also now the newly started group on complex citations. I think that's going to really have some interconnectivity with this. And actually the word versioning came up in that group's meeting in the earlier breakout today. I also think there are underlying things like the Fair Digital Object Fabric interest group, where I'm a co-chair. We certainly have ideas for instance, using the kernel record of PIDs at the registry level for marking up some of these things that are related to versioning, and also coupling to metadata and data, or maybe we should not just only talk about data here, but any digital asset, because I think very similar things goes along with instruments and all kinds of different metadata standards and whatever. So my suggestion would be to try to organize some kind of virtual workshop, or maybe a series of workshops that you just really advertise broadly at the RDA website, and try to reach out through the co-chairs mailing list to really pick up on this and just have some open discussion, of course, with a specific theme, or maybe a set of these principles that have the highest priority in your mind, and just really try to find where those touch points are and how to go forward.
Thank you, Maggie. Those are excellent suggestions. And maybe even a good closing word, because we've come to the end of the session. I'll ask my co-chairs to unmute themselves and say a few last words in this session before we close.
I'll go first. Thanks everyone. I would argue that we've been running this every plenary, and this one would have to take the cake for the number of ideas that have been given to us that we need to follow. It's been fantastic, because we're not exactly quite sure where to take this in for next directions, and you've been incredibly helpful. So thank you very much.
Ming-Fang here. I'm just echo what Leslie said. There are lots of good ideas coming out of discussion. So the Maggie suggestion is great. We will have a discussion how to organize this either group online group course, or reach out to other group, organize workshops to move things forward. I have not done all those names who made suggestions, so we'll reach out to you.
Yeah, so I think we are facing a busy summer, and hope we don't schedule anything during the summer break. But this topic is getting really very, very complex, and I hope it's at the moment I'm between so many great ideas, but then how can we manage, because it's getting such a huge task. So I think we can only do it all together, and with bringing expertise from many different people and groups and initiatives together.
Yeah, and again, thank you from my side for the really fantastic contributions to the discussion. It's really enriched our thinking, and we will see how we can take them up and work with you until we meet again at the next plenary. So thank you very much for coming and joining us today, both in person and remotely, and for contributing to this lively discussion. And we hope to keep in touch working on data versioning or versioning of digital assets. And yeah, you have a great day. It's evening in Australia now, and see you again next time.
And then thank you,
Bye-bye.
Catherine, for organizing
Oh
Yes.
for us.
absolutely. Thank you very much. As none of us
Thank you much.
be there.
I'm not sure there was much in chat, but as co-host, I think you can save the chat if you want
Yes,
to
you can.
before this closes down.
I think they're mainly.
Save chat. Yes, I saved that.
Yeah. Catherine, how many
Yes.
people were in the room?
I counted a maximum of 25 at one point, but people were coming
Wow.
in and out all the time. Yeah.
Ah, cool.
Yeah, I noticed 19 at one stage online.
Oh, great.
So that's pretty big.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
All
Thank
right.
you, everybody.
Okay,
I'll stop the
bye.
recording now. Bye.
Yeah,
Bye, thank you.
bye. I saved the chat. Bye.
Okay, great.